All right. So I have a different keyboard in front of me. I think you pronounce it Charybdis. But yeah, so this is the Charybdis from a company called Bastard Keyboards. It is an interesting thing, this one, really. So it has two halves, right? You can kind of clearly see that. But the main thing that just makes it so different is the fact that it comes with a trackball that's just integrated into the keyboard. You can get the keyball out, just like so, but there's like some mini bearings in here as well as a light sensor, and that is a signal that it can pick up as you're typing along, and effectively you got a mouse attached to your keyboard. There's a bunch of things to talk about with this keyboard. In short, I really do enjoy using it, but at the same time, there are just a couple of things that really don't make this thing for everyone. And I figured the best way to explain this keyboard is to first explain all the pros and then to dive a little bit deeper into the cons, because the odd thing about this keyboard is just the pros and cons are really tightly coupled. So maybe to show you some stuff that this keyboard can do, we first got to plug it in. The way that this is supposed to plug in depends a bit on where the keyball is. So you got to connect both halves. You got the little audio-like cable for that. But once that's done, you don't plug it into the left half, which is kind of standard with most of the keyboards that I've seen. No, what you do is you plug it into the side that has the trackball, which typically is on the right hand, because I'm assuming most people are right-handed. So, okay, there we are. Just to give a quick demo of what this looks like when you actually use it. This is me typing along, right? So I can do typing just fine. But what I can do is I can keep my hand on the home row and slightly move my thumb onto this trackball over here. And when I do, you can see that there's this mouse cursor that's moving along nicely. Now, the way that I've set this up is that I'm assuming that my right hand is on this trackball over here, which means that the other hand can then maybe function to actually do the mouse click. So on this thumb cluster over here, when I hit that key, it is a left mouse click, and when I hit that key, it is a right mouse click. So I should be able to move over this word, double click, double click, double click, all that works fine. And if I hover my thumb all the way to the bottom over here, I've got the right click. So that feels pretty dang natural, if I'm honest. You need to be a little bit clever in how you configure these things, but that's definitely something that's kind of useful and cool. For some of my other keyboards, I've always noticed that you can program the mouse with normal key presses, and that's, pretty cool. But there are these moments, especially when you want to do like click and drag, like, oh my god, that is just such an annoyance on normal key presses. But it is actually just kind of nice and workable from here. My workflow involves a little bit of video editing software, and even though shortcuts are amazing, there's just a few of these super annoying moments when you have to click and drag, and I have found this keyboard to just totally facilitate that weird little use case. Even though I don't use this keyboard all the time, I like to rotate other boards. Whenever I have to do just that one app, I find myself switching to this keyboard because this handles that use case so well. Now, another quick thing that you might have noticed as you were looking at this thing is there is actually a little bit of RGB. You can see that there's like lights coming onto this thing. You can program some sort of RGB on the entire board. Just know that you cannot program each individual key. That is something that is not supported by the software that you get with this thing. Now, another thing that you can also do with this trackball, which I thought was kind of a cute party trick, is you can actually also configure a button. So this thumb button over here is that one for me, that changes the behavior of the trackball. So normally the trackball is just a pointing device, but by keeping this one button pressed that I've programmed, you can also turn it into a scroll wheel, which I also thought was just kind of a nice thing. And again, the trackball is like pretty responsive, and its speed, to me at least, is just right. So in short, you do have access to a very convenient pointing device on this keyboard, and very few complaints actually there. Like, this is something I do find very enjoyable to use. So that's the trackball, but the shape of the keyboard and thumb cluster itself is also something that deserves a little bit of discussion. So as you can hopefully see, this keyboard is properly curved. So there's one curve for your main set of fingers, I would say. So like your pointy finger all the way to the pinky. This is where your fingers can kind of surf, in the sense that there are these lanes where your fingers can move in. Then we've also got this thumb cluster over here. And hopefully you can see by, if I hold it this way, you'll notice that the angle of the thumb cluster is kind of skewed. It's not a flat angle or anything like that. You can kind of see that the curve of the Keywell is kind of the other direction of the curve of the thumb cluster. I believe that the thinking behind that is that your thumb sometimes likes to do a little bit more of an inward motion, like you're trying to grab something with your hand quite typically. And you can kind of mimic that by just being quite aggressive in, I guess, the stagger of your thumb cluster. I don't know if that's the right word for it. But that is something that you have on both halves, so to say. Now, you do have less keys available on this side because obviously there's a trackball over here. But I have found that, in theory, this does kind of work. But when I have my hands on the keyboard like so, I think I would prefer it to just be a bit more flat. Something about that feels a little bit more comfortable. And the reason I bring it up is because I've also got this other keyboard that has a curved keywell, the Glove 80. I think it's probably the most comfortable keyboard that I've got. And yeah, this one just has a straight line all the way for the thumb. And in terms of comfort, I do think that in the end, the Glove 80 is better than this guy over here. And that's actually because of a few reasons, and I kind of want to get closer to that now. One downside of this keyboard is there's no place for your palm to rest. So as you can see, there's actually a bit of height, right? Especially if you want my hand to sort of naturally fall in there, it kind of feels like there's a bit of a palm rest over here in the middle that's just kind of missing. So what I have been experimenting with is just adding a couple of palm pads that I had lying around and having my palm just rest on that as I type. And this does kind of work. The one awkward thing is, of course, that you need to get a little bit lucky because it needs to really just fit the height quite nicely. But this did kind of work for me. What you can do, though, is you can also get an upgrade for this keyboard, which I got, which is basically this tenting solution. And to demo that, this is also a 3D printed part, by the way. But to demo that, I gotta screw in this one thing. And when you do that, you can put this thing down. You can see that there's quite an aggressive angle that you can have this keyboard in. And the thinking is that you might not always want to have your hand flat. Having something like this might be more natural, so to say. And this is a one size you can screw it on method of getting there. Now, there is a slight downside, and that is that if you want to have your hand now rest in here, you again don't have a palm rest. So how can you maybe facilitate that? Well, you can go ahead and add like yet another palm pad here. That's one thing you can do. And I will say, like, in theory, this does kind of work. I have noticed, though, that this can get a little bit uncomfortable at the same time, mainly because there is a little bit of an artery, I think, somewhere in the middle over here. And having a hand rest on something there for like hours and hours, I don't know, something uncomfortable does start to happen. Whereas your palm, there's like a little bit of muscle here. It has a bit of a cushion. You can really lean on that for a bit, but something about an exposed nerve over here, I don't know, like this felt a little bit unsafe. It feels good in the beginning, but after a while, it kind of felt less than ideal. Now, there's a funny thing that happened with this particular board. So again, I bought this secondhand. I didn't construct this. But the previous owner did do something which I think is great taste. And that is that the previous owner put in Keywell speed switches. Those switches are reasonably lightweight. They have a little tactile bump, but most importantly, they activate very quickly. Normally, you have to press a key down for like 3 millimeters before it activates. This one, I think, only needs 1 or maybe 2 millimeters, so it's a bunch quicker. And that has allowed me to do this one extra thing, which is that inside of these keycaps, I've been able to place a couple of O-rings. Effectively, that just means that the key cap won't be able to go down as much anymore and that the sound is dampened. But most importantly of all, that kind of makes these switches feel like they're short travel switches. Like you basically reduce the travel by half by doing this. And, you know, my typing style might not be the best. I tend to bottom out a lot. But by actually putting these in, I have found the typing comfort to just increase because you can type a lot quicker, it kind of feels like. And of course, preference, everyone is different. But if you are considering getting a keyboard like this, I can imagine having just speed switches in this thing does allow you to just explore that little bit of comfort, which I do recommend maybe people consider. So again, the keyboard has a bunch of stuff that I really like. I do think the palm rest is definitely something I'm totally missing. But the Keywell itself is actually pretty good. Like having a Keywell basically makes it such that your fingers don't have to travel as much. There's a lot less guesswork in terms of like, oh, where is the button? Like you can teach yourself how to properly touch type. All that stuff is pretty good. But there are a couple of just downsides that I also feel I should just kind of go ahead and mention. And the first one of these downsides is the configuration software that you get with this. So I do have to preface this with a little "it depends" here. When you get this keyboard, you can use this software called Via, which is something that you can just go ahead and use from the browser. So you can see over here, there's like a little layout with lots of buttons that I can go ahead and configure. That maps one-to-one onto what you see here, and you can configure layers. There is this annoying thing you got to do with like home row modifications. So for example, if I want to configure a home row modification here, you have to go down the special menu, and then there's an any button over here that you want to configure, and then you got to put in the QMK codes to understand that this is a momentary toggle between left shift and the F key. I have a tutorial on how to configure all of this in the channel. I'm not going to repeat my words here. But the downside of this software is that you can configure home row modifications and layer switches, but you cannot, from here, configure the timing. So how long do you keep a key pressed down before it's registered as a hold move as opposed to just a quick key press? A lot of other software does allow you to configure this. This software does not. Also, things like mouse sensitivity. What you can do is you can write your own QMK code, and then you can flash this device with that, and that allows you to do full flexibility. If you're into that, that's great. But the GUI doesn't let you. That's the one thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. So if you're excited by the prospect of really going deep in the rabbit hole and really configuring everything yourself, then you can still just kind of go nuts, and I think you don't have to worry. I checked out the Discord. There's like tons of people doing crazy stuff there. So if you're into that, again, super cool. Just know that the GUI has a couple of things that are left to be desired, so to say. A few other downsides that are really good to mention is that the board ain't cheap. Like, go to the website, especially when you have this thing pre-built. It is more expensive than the Glove 80, right? So that's a thing to consider, especially because I do think the Glove 80, as far as typing goes, is slightly more comfortable than this keyboard. Another thing to also just remember is that you can put switches in here. They have to be soldered in, and once they are in, they cannot come out. A lot of modern boards come with hot swappable switches. This keyboard does not do that, and I think every keyboard that has this Keywell phenomenon going on doesn't have that feature. The PCB needs to be curved. That makes it fragile, and that also means that you cannot just go ahead and hot swap stuff all the time. Now, the main downside of this keyboard that I want to talk about is also the main upside, and to be honest, it's the main feature of this keyboard, and that is the trackball. The trackball really does work nicely. Like, the way it moves around and, you know, very little effort, it's very intuitive, all that stuff is great. It's just that if you actually start using this as your normal mouse, that's where strain can kind of seep in. So if I think of the position that I have here, this does kind of work, but if you do this kind of movement for hours upon hours on end, then you can imagine that you're sort of straining your thumb inward. And at least for me, I've noticed that that's not necessarily super duper comfortable. And to make matters even worse, I've even noticed that because it's so easy to use this mouse, I actually had to remind myself that there are also keyboard shortcuts that I can use. Other keyboards that don't have this trackball feature, they force me to learn the keyboard shortcuts, because otherwise I have to reach for a trackpad or something like that. That is something that this keyboard actually does a bit less of. Now, you can say that's not the fault of the keyboard. That would be like a fair complaint. But I have noticed that, at least for me, this keyboard is just amazing when I got to do some mouse work where I really need the mouse for like some editing software stuff. But because I like to train myself to actually properly use shortcuts, I've actually found this keyball to kind of get in the way there. Now, to be clear, when I'm typing, this keyball is not in the way at all. Like, you have to claw a little bit, but I have noticed that it's not like when I'm typing, I'm accidentally hitting this ball over here. That's something that never really happens. But part of me does wonder, what if instead of using a thumb to track this ball, what if I could just use my palm? Maybe that would make it a little bit more obvious this is a sometime thing, not always thing. But unfortunately, I couldn't really experiment too much with that because the container for the ball at some point does get in the way. So yeah, there you go. That's kind of my review of this keyboard. It does kind of feel like I don't want to part ways with it just yet, just because the nature of the work that I do does involve like editing software, and for like that hour a day or something, I kind of like having this keyboard around. But I do think this is going to be kind of a hard sell as your main driver. Not just because of the trackball and just the strain you might get from it, but also like what it's like to travel around. So imagine that I pick it up, and if I were to maybe turn this a couple of degrees, the trackball would fall out. So this is also a keyboard that's not necessarily easy to travel with either. This is one of those keyboards that is probably going to stick onto your desk, or maybe a cupboard very close to your desk or something like that. So just be aware of it when you explore. You can find this keyboard on secondhand websites now and again. But yeah, the idea of a trackball onto the keyboard is not necessarily a bad idea. Just like having a bit of a curve on your thumb cluster is not necessarily going to be the worst idea. It just kind of feels like this idea and this design needs like an extra iteration to really make it such that I can advise it to pretty much everyone. Until then, it does feel, at least to me, like it's a very cool keyboard, but one to only use sparingly.